Hello, this is Jamie Mitchell, and we are back with another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have, ICE can now enter your home without a warrant to look for migrants, DOJ memo says, from dailybuilder.com. That was posted by LegioX, and that's a cross post from the Law subreddit. And yeah, I personally don't really care for that. The Fourth Amendment says there should be no unreasonable searches or seizures without a warrant. But both sides of the uniparty have found their way around the Constitution for years. So I don't know why they'd start caring about it now. The Patriot Act was over 20 years ago now, and that was pretty much the same thing. Only instead of migrants, it was terrorists. So the government, they don't have to abide by the Constitution. That's the thing. They can justify whatever they want to. Who's going to stop them? They have the legal monopoly on the use of force. So if they want to justify something, they'll probably just justify it. And yeah, that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have, a Venezuelan delivery driver was disappeared after making a wrong turn. The Trump administration claims they know where he is. From independent.co.uk, and that's from posted by Baton 13. And yeah, I personally don't think that sounds very good. But ultimately, if the government wants to disappear you at any second, as I've said, the government has a monopoly on legal use of force. It can justify whatever it feels like, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. And yeah, I personally don't think people should be disappeared. And I don't know how hyperbolic it is. Of course, it's Reddit. Reddit's always going to be a bit hyperbolic when it comes to anti-Trump narratives. But regardless, the state can justify whatever it wants to, and there's sometimes nothing you can do about it. But if this was this is during Biden's tenure, and the person was disappeared for good reasons. Reddit would sweep it under the rug. So it just goes to show you, it's really just who's in the in group, who's in the out group. That's another thing I always like to say during this podcast. It doesn't really. Most people don't have values, only teams. Then we have, Trump says he is unaware that the order for him to facilitate the return of Kilmar Abrego Garcia was supported by SCOTUS 9-0 and is still in effect, and has not yet asked El Salvador for Garcia's return, nor instructed others to do so. And that's from Mediaite.com, and that's from CH4Locks, and that's cross-post from the Law subreddit. And yeah, ultimately, if he wants to disregard the Supreme Court, I personally don't really care for it. I think we should probably have checks and balances. But, the president has always had the ability to disregard the Supreme Court if they want to. Even look at, 200 years ago, Andrew Jackson, when it came to the Trail of Tears, the Supreme Court said you can't do the Trail of Tears to the Native Americans. Then Andrew Jackson said, oh, Marshall made his decision, then let him enforce it. So, ultimately, the president can always disregard the Supreme Court if they feel like it, and sometimes there's nothing he can do about it. And yeah, I personally don't think, they should probably just let this guy back in, because, the libs don't seem to shut up about him. I think he might be a crisis actor, because, he said he might be in prison, and the next thing you know, he was having martinis with that Maryland senator. But yeah, if they want to, if he wants to disregard the Supreme Court, that's on him. I just think it's funny how the libs said, oh, the Supreme Court is illegitimate under Biden's tenure, since that was the one branch of the government they didn't control. But now, since they agree with one of their rulings, it's suddenly this great paragon of American governance. It's the same with the Constitution. During Biden's tenure, they said, oh, we got to get with the Constitution. It's just getting in the way. Now it's a sacred, holy document, and I'm sure if the Democrats win 2028, the sides will reverse again, and they'll try. Yeah, it just goes to show you, most people don't have values, only teams, and they'll just they only care about who's in the in group, who's in the out group. During Biden's tenure, the Supreme Court was the out group, since it was majority conservative. Now that Trump's in, since it's ruling against him, it's in the in group, and that's my thoughts there. Then we have, if you say you love freedom, but you don't believe freedom is for everybody, then the thing you love is not freedom, it is privilege, from hosted by Helpful Feeding, and that's cross-post from the Wamma subreddit, and that was a quote from Tim Walz at the governor of Minnesota in Minnesota House Chamber. And yeah, personally, I think that's a very libertarian quote. But it's very generic. You've had stuff like quotes like that going all the way back to Voltaire saying, what did Voltaire say? It was, I disprove what you say, but I will defend you the death you right to say it. And yeah, it's also, Tim Walz only cares about freedom right now because he's in the out group, because his side's not in power currently. When he looked like his side was going to take power, he went on MSNBC and said, "Oh, we need exemptions for the First Amendment in regards to hate speech and misinformation." So it's just it's not real libertarianism. It's just we need freedom because the the out group's in power right now. When it's the in group, when the in group's in power, it will be shut up and do what you're told. And it's just like how during Trump's first tenure, the left was all about we were the resistance, and then Biden took office, and then it was suddenly comply without question. So it just goes to show you that people say they're for freedom, but then their side takes power, and suddenly they despise freedom. And yeah, that's my thoughts on that issue. A lot of people want freedom as long as you don't do anything that they don't want you to do. It's like the people like Tim Walz will say, "Oh, I'm for freedom," but then you say something. He needs to be hate speech and misinformation, and he'd call for your censorship. Or you say, "Oh, I don't want to vaccinate myself," and he'd say, "No, you need to vaccinate yourself. That's not the freedom doesn't include freedom to infect others." And it just goes to show you that people, they'll say they're for freedom as long as they'll say they're pro-choice as long as the choices are the same ones that they would make. Then we have Judge blocks Trump executive order stripping away union rights from HuffingtonPost.com, posted by Swamphanky Dan, and that's a cross post from the Law subreddit. And yeah, I personally don't really care for the idea of the union as a whole, but I do think if workers want to form unions, they should be able to. I think unions are voluntary collectivism, what I'm against is forced collectivism. But yeah, this seems to be a public sector union. Let's see, yeah, blocking Trump administration from restoring collective bargaining rights for hundreds of thousands of federal workers. So yeah, I personally don't really care for federal unions. I don't think we should have public sector unions. But because the government already has too much power, we don't need government workers to have even more power than they already do. You already can't really. Government workers already have. It's already impossible to fire a lot of them because of just general bureaucracy stuff. So I definitely do think we shouldn't have public sector unions at all. So I would agree with Trump on this issue. But regardless, I do think if people will justify what they justify, if they want to form a union, they should be able to. But if the management says no more unions, and in this case Trump would be the management since he's the head of the federal government, and these are unions of federal workers, that they should be able to as well. And that's my thoughts on that issue. And we have these town halls are getting to him. Keep it up from Ragnarok KXG, and that's a cross post from the Trump virus subreddit, and that's the truth from Donald Trump. The radical left Democrats are paying a fortune to have people infiltrate the town halls of Republican congressmen/women and senators. These great patriot politicians did not treat them nicely, had them immediately ejected from the room. They are disruptors and troublemakers. You must allow your audience to know what you are up to against, or else they will think they are Republicans, and that there is dissension in the party. There is not. There is only love and unity. Republicans are happy with what is taking place in our country. We will all love America. And yeah, I'm kind of torn on the statement. I do think there might be some left-wing provocateurs, as Trump says, heading into Republican town halls. But that doesn't mean there's no dissent at all in the Republican Party, like he wants people to think. There's always going to be dissent within both branches of the Uniparty. You have the more authoritarian sides, and you do like in the Republican Party, you have the more authoritarian people like Trump, and the more libertarian people like Thomas Massie or Rand Paul. And yeah, there'll always be some dissent, I think, in a healthy democracy. But Trump, he's like an average redder. He's like, any dissent at all is fascism. And yeah, if he wants to say that, I'm for freedom of speech, but you shouldn't just say any dissent against me is a left-wing psyop, because I do think some dissent against him is probably left-wing psyops, but you can't just use that as an excuse to say all dissent against me is a left-wing psyop. Then we have White House Brexit Press Secretary Carolyn Leavitt suggests DOJ could arrest Supreme Court justices from the dailybeast.com, posted by Donald Key. And yeah, as I said earlier, the Supreme Court was in the out-group during Biden's presidency, but now they're in the in-group during Trump's presidency. So, though of course they'll say, oh, the president can't just arrest Supreme Court justices, but even if they'd also say that the Supreme Court is illegitimate when it ruled the wrong way during Biden's tenure. But regardless, I do think if Trump wants to instruct the DOJ to just arrest Supreme Court justices and he can get away with it, he probably would. But I personally don't think that's something he can get away with. But if he does get away with it, ultimately, sometimes there's nothing you can do. The state is legal monopoly and use of force, and whoever people want to follow, they'll follow, So, and ultimately, a lot of times that's the president, and that's why, I don't know if we should even have a president in the first place. It's too much centralized authority. Technically, you have three branches of government with the executive, judicial, and legislative, but, most people are just going to do whatever the executive branch says, and yeah, it doesn't really matter, but in the end, it doesn't really matter at all, because it doesn't matter who's writing or making the laws. It matters how they're enforced. So ultimately, I don't think Trump's in a super. He's probably healthy for his age, but he is almost 80, so I don't think he's this 20, 30 something athlete. So I don't think he's going to be individually enforcing the laws. What matters is how the people who are enforcing the laws, the athletic, able-bodied cops or soldiers, do what they justify to do. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Congressman Sri Thanedar introduces articles of impeachment against President Donald J. Trump for high crimes and misdemeanors from phnr.house.gov, posted by Dr. Who 07. And I like their comment here. It would be great if this went somewhere, but it won't. As this will do, all this will do is add fuel to Trump's narrative of witch hunt to get him and Dems pushing political prosecution. And I would agree with that. I definitely don't think the Dems are in any position to impeach Trump right now. They already tried twice and failed. Eventually, you just can't. I do think all modern presidents deserve to be impeached, but I don't think the political will is there to impeach Trump currently, especially since it's already failed twice, and it would just fail again because it would just be another virtue signaling impeachment because the numbers aren't there in the Senate currently for an impeachment. But yeah, if he wants to try and impeach Trump, I think he should be able to. But I personally just think that's kind of virtue signaling and won't go anywhere. Then we have EO allowing for fascism is in plain sight from Patom 13, and that's a cross post from the Trump virus subreddit. And let's see, that EO is presidential action, strengthening and unleashing America's law enforcement to pursue criminals and protect innocent citizens. And yeah, I personally think, the president, we shouldn't be strengthening America's law enforcement. I think they already have too much of the law on their side, stuff like qualified immunity, which means, you can't go against them. If they do ever wrong you, you don't really have the ability to go against them, because they're immune in a lot of in civil cases. But regardless, Reddit's going to say anything it doesn't like is fascism, and it's been calling Trump a fascist for 10 years. And I definitely do think Trump does abuse his authority as the president, but I feel like Obama and Biden did as well, and Reddit never called them out for it. It's just Reddit doesn't care for red fascism, but blue fascism is completely fine. So, it just goes to show you that nothing ever really happens, and a lot of Reddit's just fear-mongering that the outgroup is gonna become like the Nazis or the Soviets or the CCP, but nothing ever really happens. I definitely think a lot of the government can't really get away with as much as people think they can these days because of social media, and they can't. Trump. They say, oh, he's a fascist, and he's going to start holocausting people any day now. But, he can't even get away with an edgy comment without Reddit and the legacy media going ballistic. So, I do think, this executive order is overly authoritarian, but I think a lot of Biden's and Obama's were too. And the Democratic Party was arguably the party that centralized power in the presidency in the first place. So, definitely, you definitely shouldn't be taking them that seriously. I would say, they're just gonna do a lot of the same shit when they take power back again, and only Reddit will say this is entirely justified. If you dissent at all, you're a fascist bigot. And that just goes to show you, it's all just who's on what team rather than people actually having values. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have the Trump family just announced they are opening up a new private club in Washington only for CEOs, millionaires, and foreign oligarchs, where members will get secret access to the Trump administration from Donald Key, and that's crossed from the Chris Murphy subreddit. And yeah, I personally think that's kind of grifting and oligarchy, but the Democratic Party does tons of grifting and oligarchy as well, but Reddit would never call them out on it because they're the in-group, and Trump and his friends are the out-group. So, I personally think if a government official wants to open up their own private club, they should be able to do so, justify whatever you want to. But, I think people are increasingly realizing that politics is grift when the out-group does it. If only they could realize it's grift when the in-group does it as well, that would be great. And yeah, I think we're gonna wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.